So Drop has a premise that I absolutely love. It's about a woman who's going on a first date to a restaurant, and when she arrives, she starts getting airdropped memes to her phone. At first they start off sort of weird but mostly innocent, then they start to get vaguely threatening, and suddenly she's in this situation where if she doesn't do everything her phone tells her to, the consequences could be fatal. Now, what I absolutely love about the premise of this movie is the use of technology. Now, that might sound kind of weird, making an entire movie based around the airdrop feature, but I actually think it's kind of smart. The whole premise with airdropping is that it only works whenever you're within a certain proximity of someone else. Now, for the sake of the movie, they extend the distance to 50 feet, but it creates a scenario for the character where someone is contacting them, they have no idea who, and there's no way for them to contact them back. And because of the proximity, they know they're in the room with them. And so it creates a whole mystery for the film where everybody in the restaurant is a potential suspect. I just thought that was a really clever way into a film, and I just love it whenever films use things like new technology to tell stories that wouldn't have been possible in any earlier time. And it's just a great way to comment on our current times. We live in a society where there's almost an expectation that we put on ourselves and of others that you have to be contactable at all times, or you have to respond to every message you get quickly. And if you've ever had the experience where you've had someone airdrop you some random meme, it is kind of disorienting because they're around you, but you've no idea who did it or why they did it. And so as the movie kept going, I was really interested to see how they were going to keep, rolling with this premise. I was also really intrigued by this movie because the whole thing is set in one location. It's a way filmmakers can save money. Locations are expensive, and if you just have one fancy looking location, it can make the budget look a lot bigger than it actually is. But the challenge with it is, how do you keep that location interesting for the entire runtime? But Drop makes it even harder for itself by basically setting the entire film in a restaurant. Usually films that have just one location are set in like a house, and houses have lots of mini locations. You've got a kitchen, you've got a living room, bedroom, bathroom, garden area. There's lots of separate areas for action to take place in. A restaurant is essentially just one big room, and they're going to be spending most of that time at one table. Trying to keep one location interesting for the entire film would be a challenge for any filmmaker, but there's a number of ways that they try to overcome it in this film, and they didn't always work for me. For one, if you're setting like 70% of your movie at a table at a restaurant, you've got to find a way to keep the waiter interesting. Whenever you're at a restaurant, there's got to be some interaction with a waiter coming to your table, asking for your order, asking for drinks, and for what's supposed to be a thriller, that could be really boring. So they've got to find a way to keep every interaction with the waiter somehow memorable or interesting or impact the scene in a different way. And the way they do that is by making him the comic relief character, but he's so over the top that it doesn't really mesh with the rest of the tone of the movie. And look, there's always an overlap between comedy and horror, but the waiter felt like a character out of a completely different movie. He just didn't match the vibe of anyone else in it. The other way they try to keep this whole thing visually interesting is with the text messages. Now, with this criticism, I totally get that this is a me thing. It's probably not going to impact anyone else's enjoyment of the film too much, and I completely understand why they've done it. But every time the character gets a text message, it's shown with these very elaborate, fancy looking motion graphics. And they do it for a number of reasons. Because the movie is set in one location, it does help keep things visually interesting. The alternative would be to cut to a close-up of the phone every time she gets a text message, and that would be slow. You'd have to give the audience enough time to read it every time it came up. Whereas if you use the motion graphics, you can show the message that the character is receiving and the reaction to the message at the same time. It is a totally understandable choice, but it's something I don't like that much in films because it's just not how we use phones. And I guess it was kind of frustrating for me because I feel like whenever I've seen movies, that are about phones and technology, where it's not just an incidental thing, it always does it badly. It never feels like it reflects how I actually use it. And at the start it did, but whenever they suddenly started moving into the motion graphic territory, I just felt a little bit more disconnected from it. And again, I admit that is kind of a minor problem. The bigger problem is because this entire film is set at one table, they have to keep finding excuses for the character to leave that table, but the trap of it being set at a restaurant means that she always has to return back to the table, and so there comes this point where the plot has to keep her moving, but you never really believe that she would make the decisions that she's making. It's almost like the illusion of the movie is broken. Like, we all know that movies are written and the actions are predetermined, but we connect with them because it feels like there's real characters making real choices. Whenever that's gone, it's just so much harder to care. And unfortunately, by the end of the movie, it just feels like the entire film jumps the shark. The mystery of the film does keep it kind of entertaining all the way through. It's always fun to try and work out who the bad guy is, what the reveal actually is going to be. But the end of the film is so ludicrous, you end up feeling like is that it? It was one of those scenarios where I was really hoping that the film was going to win me back at the end with this knockout ending, and it just did the exact opposite. And so by the time the credits rolled, I was just really disappointed because I loved the setup for the movie. You know, I loved our two main characters. I thought they were great leads, but I just don't think the movie really had enough to sustain itself. There are still parts of it that are pretty fun, and it has a pretty brilliant opening credit sequence, but it's just one of those films where my peak of the enjoyment was at the start of the film, and then just slowly through the runtime it dropped. If you've seen Drop, let me know what you thought in the comments below, and if you want to make sure that you don't miss anything else coming up on the channel, make sure to subscribe.